So I'd like you to imagine yourselves away from this room for a second and picture yourself in 1837 out on the steppe between Iran and Afghanistan, between Mashhad and Herat. A war is about to break out. The new Shah of Iran, Mohammed II Qajar, has declared war on Herat. In his coronation speech, he's promised to take this border city away from the Afghans and to retake it for Iran. And up the road on this hot summer's night in 1837 comes a single figure on a horse. He's been riding for 2 days and 1 night. He's exhausted. And even as you're watching, you can see this figure slumping forward. Maybe some of you are doing the same in your cups this evening. With exhaustion and tiredness. And at some point, maybe 2 in the morning, he actually falls forward onto the mane of the horse and falls asleep. He doesn't fall off. He's asleep for maybe 10, 20 minutes. Something wakes him. But by the time he wakes, the horse has lost the road. And he wakes up, it's the middle of the night. He's no idea where he is. Now, even today, this borderland between Iran and Afghanistan is not somewhere that you particularly want to get lost in, even in the middle of the day. At night, in 1837, with 2 warring armies, as well as brigands and opium smugglers, it's certainly not the kind of place that you want to be wandering around. So he's very relieved when, about 5 in the morning, finally the first light of dawn appears on the Shah Jahan Mountains, and he's able to orientate himself and head back to what he imagines will be the military road. But even as he's heading back, he sees ahead of him what he least wants to see, which is a large body of horsemen heading up this narrow valley directly for him. Now, he does exactly what any of us would do in this situation. He makes himself scarce. He backs off. He finds a little narrow cutting into the side of the valley and hides himself there. But what he sees coming up the valley towards him changes the history of this entire region for 100 years. And what he sees coming towards him, well, I'll just give a little background maybe before I tell you what he sees coming towards him. So where are we? 1837. This is 22 years after Waterloo. Napoleon is kicked out of the picture. The French are no longer in the competition. There are 2 powers competing to divide Central Asia, indeed Asia, between them. One is the British, the other is the Russians. Representing Britain is not the British government. It is a company, a public limited company with shareholders, a board of directors, annual general meetings, all the things that any company has. This is the East India Company. What is different about the East India Company is, as well as a board of directors and annual general meetings and shareholders and dividends, is that the company also has the largest standing army in Asia. There is no modern equivalent. Think PepsiCo with F-16 jets, or Microsoft with nuclear submarines, or Halliburton with a continent. I mean, thankfully, it doesn't exist. But the East India Company, by 1837, has gobbled up the whole of the old Mughal Empire and advanced as far as the Sutlej and is looking onto the Himalayas. The far side of the Himalayas, you've got the Russians who've been moving southwards at a rate of about 100 miles every decade since the time of Peter the Great. They're now facing on to Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva, all these Central Asian stans. Now, any old buffer sitting in a club in Pall Mall or an officer sitting in St. Petersburg can see that these 2 forces are coming towards each other. And at some point in the future, they will meet in the unmapped area that we today call Afghanistan. But equally, anyone can also see that they're still about 3,000 miles apart, which is why you have all these polemicists creating all this, so the kind of 19th century equivalents of Neil Ferguson or Andrew Roberts writing these slightly toxic little documents encouraging us all to go up and fight the good fight, take Central Asia, seize the Hindu Kush, they say. If you go out there, you will succeed. Can take the markets of Central Asia. You can seize all this. The Indus River will provide the motorway for Manchester cotton to seize the bazaars. You can take all these markets. It'll all be yours if you just be bold. Defeat the Russian bear, get there first. So there's a huge lobby in London to go and take this area. But anyone looking at the map can see that there's no actual good reason to do so, that Britain and Russia are separated by many thousands of miles of mountain and impenetrable, unmapped territory. Which is why what our young guy on the horse, a guy called Henry Rawlinson, a young British intelligence officer, what he sees coming up the valley towards him matters. Because what he sees is not brigands, it's not opium smugglers, it's not the Heratis going to invade Persia, it's not the Persians going to invade Afghanistan. It is a fully uniformed troop of Imperial Russian Cossack cavalry. And by pure chance, the fact that this young spy has lost the road, has fallen asleep, has ended up in this extraordinary, unlikely position of being up this river valley, means he actually sees these guys entering Afghanistan. They've been traveling incognito, but they've just changed into their official uniforms in order to cross the border. And he happens to see it. And for the hawks in London, this is the big intelligence discovery of a generation. This is the weapons of mass destruction. Or perhaps more likely, it is in fact the yellow cake. Because what he sees is not all that is assumed to be. It's not the Russians going to invade Afghanistan as it's presented subsequently. It's in fact an exploratory expedition to see whether possibly the Russians could maybe open diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. But the hawks seize on this in a way that would be impossible to imagine today. Imagine if a group of ideologically driven hawks were to seize a bit of dodgy intelligence and create a war entirely fictitiously. I mean, luckily we have checks and balances in place today to make sure that nothing like this could ever possibly happen again. But in this occasion, sadly, in the Victorian period, these things were not in place. And what we have is a plan developing. The British have an intelligence asset, as they call it. This is Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who is the grandson of the first emir of Afghanistan. His grandfather, Ahmad Shah Durrani, created this enormous empire based in Kandahar, lost by the time he comes to power. And Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, who's a wonderful poet, an admirer of gardens, a great connoisseur of jewels, but not a man to sort of take on the battlefield, loses his empire by the age of 21 to this man in the middle, Dost Muhammad Khan. The plan that the hawks produce is we will do regime change. They don't call it that, but this is what it means. You take Shah Shuja and you replace him. He's pro-British. You replace the pro-Russian, Dost Muhammad, and it's all very easy. You go home. By 1839, 18 months after that sighting, the war is all set to break out. 40,000 East India Company sepoys, 20,000 irregulars, supported by 130,000 camels, and 38,000 camp followers assemble in Firozpur on the banks of the Sutlej. There are 3,000 camels carrying only the regimental wine cellar, 30 camels carrying nothing but cheroots, and one camel carries nothing but eau de cologne. One regiment even brings its own pack of foxhounds. The only thing they don't bring is a map, because they've no idea where they're going. There is no map, so up they go. Hands up anyone here who's been on the railway line from Quetta to Lahore. Declan, surely. No? Yes, two. 1, 2, 3. This is the route that the railway now takes, and it's the route that, of course, the Taliban also take into the back end of Kandahar. And the East India Company army, they don't know where the water holes are, they have absolutely no idea where anything is. In this picture, you can see a familiar scene from anyone who's traveled in South Asia. Where's Afghanistan? They say, go straight, sir, go straight. And here they are, over the mountains, there's troops going in every conceivable direction, up about, look at this lot, going up a cliff face. Here they are, more of them. They have absolutely no idea where they're going. And they lose about a quarter of their army through sheer negligence. They don't know where the water is, they haven't got any food, they run out of goats. One of the local emirs, the Khan of Kalat, it says, "You've brought an army in, but how do you propose to get it out again?" A good question. Anyway, such is the surprise when this lot arrive in Kandahar that the emirs of Kandahar simply flee and they take Kandahar. British intelligence then intervenes, as we know, and as Sherrod has told us, MI6 never gets anything wrong. They say there is no need to bring the cannons, these enormous cannons they've transported out of India, don't need to bring them any further because Ghazni is undefended. Sadly, Ghazni turns out to be rather well defended. It is, in fact, the most well-defended fortress in Central Asia. But some gallant chap offers to blow up the front door, in they go, they take it, and within a month, Shah Shuja is back on the throne. And the entire expedition seems justified, rather like the Americans in 2001, having taken Afghanistan with far greater ease than anyone expected. Afghanistan has been conquered. The Russians have been given one in the eye. They've failed to take Khiva. An entire Russian expedition to Khiva has been lost in a blizzard. So everyone's feeling very smug. And there's this extraordinary kind of 9 months when suddenly we have peace. The Memsahibs are brought up from Calcutta. Lady Sale arrives with a grand piano, her unmarried daughter, and seeds from her kitchen garden in Agra. The following spring, she's writing, "My sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, and in the kitchen garden, the potatoes especially thrive." There's cricket and horse racing and open-air amateur theatricals. The foxhounds are taken out hunting. But it all begins to go wrong. And it goes badly wrong, not because of politics, but because of economics. It's perfectly possible to conquer Afghanistan. Many people have done it. You have a whole succession of conquerors, the White Huns, the Kushans, the Bactrians, the Lodis, the Pathans, the Timurids, the Mongols. A whole succession of dynasties have taken Afghanistan. The problem is, particularly if you're a Western power with a whole economy to support, it's impossible to support an occupation because it is, as Dost Muhammad tells the Governor-General, William McNaughton, when he surrenders, this is a country of only stones and men. There is no oil to rob, there is no jewels to take. There are, in fact, enormous mineral deposits, but the Victorians didn't know that. So it eats up the profits of the East India Company, eats up the profit of the opium trade. So within a few months, the economists in Calcutta are saying, we can't afford this. It looked good on the map. It looked fantastic, we'll seize this. But the Indus isn't suitable for sending steamers up. There are no Manchester cottons dominating the bazaars of Central Asia. It's eating up all the profits. And we have to retrench. So several things happened. First of all, again, it couldn't happen today. The occupying forces lose interest in Afghanistan and go and invade somewhere else. In this case, it's Hong Kong and the Opium War. Secondly, the economists say, the accountants say, we can't afford this. And they come up with a brilliant solution. What we'll do, they say, is we'll train up an Afghan national army who we can leave in place, and then we can go off back home and we can leave our puppet in place. So this is what they do. But in the process of training up these guys, they manage to have to take the lands from the old feudal nobility. The feudal nobility get pissed off that they've lost their lands, so they stir up resentment. And then fatally, they break their contract with the frontier tribes. The Afridis, the Ghilzais, everyone has always paid these guys. Later in the Raj, there is an adage, thrash the Sindhis, beat the Baluch, but just pay the bloody Pathans. And this is what successive generations have always done. Nadir Shah going off to take the Peacock Throne, to loot Mughal Delhi, he pays the border tribes in and he pays them out. It's just easier. But the British break their contract with the Ghilzais. They have offered them, whatever it is, 10,000 pieces of gold to keep the passes open. They pay them only 1,000. Immediately, the passes are cut. The posts stop getting through. Finally, the British make the fatal mistake of sleeping with the Afghan women. Now, this is a big mistake. Here we have an Afghan woman. And one of the worst offenders is Alexander Burns, this kind of oversexed Scottish deputy governor. And Burns goes and runs off with the girlfriend of Abdullah Khan Achakzai, who's one of the leading Afghan nobles. And rather than just sort of, turning up outside his house and throwing stones through the window, Abdullah Khan Achakzai turns up, burns down Burns's house, cuts his head off, hangs up the trunk of his body on a meat hook, and then makes this speech. Now we are justified in throwing off the English yoke. They stretch the hand of tyranny to dishonor private citizens, great and small. Making love to a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath that follows it. But we have to put a stop to it right here, right now. Otherwise, and this is the key quote, otherwise these English will ride the donkey of their desires into the field of stupidity. Now, we've all done that in our time, but not a good idea in Afghanistan. And it doesn't end well. So Burns is already dead. McNaughton goes out to negotiate in his top hat and blue-tinted spectacles. He's shot dead by the Afghan negotiating team. Next up, the Afghans seize the entire British food and ammunition and arms from two outlying forts. They haul British cannon up onto the ridge and they start pelting the British cantonment, which you can see is just a line of tents in a valley. There's a few barrack blocks, there's a tiny bit of wall, and there's a ditch around it. But it's more or less a completely indefensible position, which is of course, why they've chosen it for the modern NATO cantonment today. Here's the British leading general, William Elphinstone. Elphinstone is a gout-ridden old fool who hasn't fought since Waterloo. He's only given the job because he has the best grouse moors in the borders, and Lord Auckland, the Governor-General, wants to shoot there in his retirement. Elphinstone is manoeuvred onto a horse. He falls off the horse falls on him, and that's the end of Elphinstone. So basically, it is what we call, a technical term, it is a goat fuck. The whole thing is completely screwed by this stage. And there's no alternative for it but to head back to India. And they are given free passage by the nobles. They leave all their heavy artillery behind, and off they go. And among those going is my great-great-uncle, this man, Colin Mackenzie, who writes about he describes this terrifying scene when they march out. The only troops left are sepoys from Bengal and Bihar who've never seen snow before. They march out into 4 foot of snowdrifts, wearing their tiny shorts, which is the only uniform they've got. And first come the cavalry, then come the infantry, then comes the baggage. By the time that the infantry and the cavalry have gone ahead, the Ghazis, the Afghans, seize the baggage. So that when the cavalry arrive at their camping space, they're waiting for their bearer, they're waiting for their dinner, they want their tents put up, where's the hot water? No bearers, no tents, no hot water, no food. 6 o'clock, it's -20, and there's still no sign of it. By 9 o'clock at night, it's -30. It's very, very cold. There's no tents, and it's quite clear they're not going to come. Well, the Afghans, Mackenzie runs a troop of Jezailchis, the Afghan mercenaries. They know what to do in the snow. They dig foxholes 20 feet wide, they light a fire in the center, and then they fan out in a circle, body to body, using their body heat to keep them warm, and they put all their cloaks above them, all their turbans, any textile they have over them. And that way they wake up in the morning with all their bits intact. But the poor old sepoys have no idea what to do. They go to bed, and they don't wake up, most of them. Those who do wake up find that their extremities, their fingers and their toes, look like charred logs of wood. And in this situation, they wake up, most of the army can't even fire a musket or crawl more than their hands and knees. Wazir Akbar Khan, the leader of the Afghan resistance, appears and herds them into the Kabul Pass, where they're massacred. There's this terrible, terrible massacre. The confusion was fearful. This is Lady Sale. We had not proceeded half a mile when we were heavily fired upon. The pony my daughter rode was wounded in the ear and the neck. I had only one musket ball in my arm, but 3 others passed through my cloak near the shoulder. The pass choked up for a considerable period, and we were stationary under heavy fire. Many poor wretches died round the tent that night. Many women and children were abducted. So 18,500 men, women, and children have left the cantonment that first night. 4,000 die around the tents on the first camping site. 3,000 more die in the Kurkabul Pass in the ambush. The next day they have to march up the Tezin Pass where they're caught in an enormous blizzard. Out of those 18,500 men, women and children, of only 4,000 of whom are fighting men, of those only 3,000 come down the Tezin Pass. That's lost 15,000 in 3 days. Of those 3,000, by 7 o'clock that night, they reached the village of Degdalik, where the rebels have erected a holly hedge, which completely blocks the narrowest part of the path. It's covered with thorns. It's impossible to clamber over. There is a desperate scene at about 7 at night in the darkness when the cavalry trampled the infantry who are trying to clamber over this thing. Only 200 people make it over the holly hedge. This is only night 4. They are exposed the following day at dawn at the village of Gundamuk. They only have about 15 or 20 rounds each left. They fire those rounds. They fight on with their bayonets. And then they're all slaughtered, with the one exception of this man, Thomas Suter, after whom the modern NATO camp in Helmand is named. He's taken hostage. The Afghans are very rigorous in their hierarchy of enslavement. The British officer class are herded away and kept, but 150 are taken hostage because Dost Muhammad and his harem are in Ludhiana and they want to retrieve them. The rest are divided. British other ranks and sepoys put together. The able-bodied ones are sold off in slavery in Central Asia. The Uzbek traders into whose hands they are sold, there's about 2,000 of them who haven't got frostbite. They take a carpet needle and they sew through the clavicle of their hostages a horsehair rope, which they attach to the saddles. 5 or 6 of them are then attached to a single saddle. Their hands are tied behind their back, and that way they're led off up to Bukhara and the big slave markets in Central Asia. If you don't keep up, your entire chest frame is ripped open. Those who are not able-bodied, in other words, those who've got frostbite or are injured, are stripped of their clothes and sent off into the snow, where they die. Lady Sale, as she's being led back into captivity, records the scene. We passed 200 dead bodies in half an hour, most of them Europeans, every one of them naked and covered with large gaping wounds. What she's not saying is that what the Afghans do to the captured dead is they cut off the genitals and stuff it in the mouths. As the day advanced, several poor wretches of Hindustanis, camp followers who had escaped the massacre of the night before, made their appearance behind rocks and within caves where they'd taken shelter from the murderous knives of the Afghans and the inclemency of the climate. They had been stripped of all they possessed, and few could crawl more than a few yards on their hands and feet, being frostbitten. Here Johnson found 2 of his servants. One had his hands and feet frostbitten and had a fearful sword cut across one hand and a musket ball in his stomach. The other had his right arm completely cut off. Neither had tasted food for 5 days, and they were both stark naked, utterly destitute of covering. Wounded, naked, and starving, they had set fire to bushes and grass and huddled together to impart warmth. Subsequently, we heard that scarcely any of these poor wretches had escaped from this defile, and driven to extremes of hunger, they had sustained life by feeding on their dead comrades. 15 cavalrymen make it to the Nimla Gardens near Jalalabad. There they're offered naan and must, bread and yogurt, by the gardeners, who then club them to death as they eat it. One man makes it through to Jalalabad out of 18,500 of the Brits. Subsequently, about 5 days later, a party of Gurkhas who've somehow managed to survive in the snow make it through. And even more bizarrely, 6 days later, a single Greek merchant, Dr. Barnes, who'd been selling kebabs or whatever, has been hiding in a cave drinking Urdu. I don't know, but it somehow makes it through alive. Otherwise, the entire army of 16,500 men is completely wiped out. Cannibalism, slavery, mass destruction. But for the Afghans, this is their big national liberation struggle. What Michael Collins and the Easter Rising is to the Irish, what the Yorktown and Washington is for the Americans, what Garibaldi and the Risorgimento is to the Italians, this is to the Afghans. And when I went to see Sherrod in Kabul, his embassy was located in Wazir Akbar Khan, which is named after Wazir Akbar Khan, who masterminded this. Which is why you have to understand how the family of the leading Quisling reacts, because Shah Shuja was the chief of the Popelzai tribe. The current chief of the Popelzai tribe is a man called Hamid Karzai. And he has to distance himself at every stage from his backers, the Americans, if he's not to be seen to puppet, if he's not to be seen to be a Quisling, and hence all these extraordinary statements that you read by Karzai, saying that he hates the Americans he wants to join the Taliban and all this. The only way he can survive as a democratic leader is to show that he's not Vichy France, that he's not the Quisling, he's not the man who sold, the family that sold Afghanistan down the river. A final word. When I was following the route of the retreat, I thought that in order to write this book, I needed to see, well, first of all, to collect all the Afghan sources, of which there turned out to be an extraordinary number. 2 epic poems, the autobiography of Shah Shuja, 3 court poems, the letters of the resistance leaders. All this stuff was there, well known to Afghan historians, bizarrely never used by any historian writing in the English language. And there must be huge amounts more. I didn't look in Peshawar. Peshawar has been tricky to get to over the last couple of years. But there is a huge amount of stuff, I'm sure, sitting there in Pashtun, which future historians can reap. But I also wanted to go and do the route of the retreat. And I had a lucky break in that my second night in Kabul, I was taken off by Amrullah Saleh, who was then Karzai's security chief. I wasn't quite sure what he wanted for me. It turned out he disapproved of my last book, The Last Mughal. And he kind of hauled me in and gave me what was basically kind of bad book review. And he said, this is not a patriotic book, he said. And this time you will do a better one. And he handed me over into the care of this man called Anwar Khan Jigdalik, who's the former Afghan Olympic wrestling champion of Afghanistan. He was 18 foot tall by about 20 foot wide. And we went off in a whole convoy of Anwar Khan Jigdalik's trucks on the route of the retreat, out of Kabul, past the barracks, through the Kabul, up the Tezim Pass, down to Jagdalik. There we were given this enormous feast, which saved our life, because we were trying to get to Gandamak, where the last stand took place, now below Tora Bora, immediately behind Tora Bora. The day that we were trying to get there, it turned out that they were burning the poppy crop. The government sent out a whole load of policemen. The villagers resisted. They shot 5 or 6 policemen. They seized 90 hostages. By the time, if we had turned up that afternoon, we'd almost certainly, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. Sherrod very sweetly gave me this little kind of gizmo, or security people, which was this sort of thing the size of a BlackBerry, which if you pressed a button, you had 30 seconds to identify your captor. You had to say, it's Anwar Khan, or whoever it is, and it would beam it up to the British Embassy, or to the G4 security base in the middle, a privatized security base in the embassy. Anyway, this is all a distraction. The point was that we never got to Gandamak because we had this enormous feast, had to go back to Jalalabad that night. But the following day, the elders of Gandamak came into Jalalabad to negotiate the release of they had their hostages, they wanted to get their compensation. So Anwar Khan was called in to negotiate, and we had this extraordinary meeting in Jalalabad on a hilltop with all the drones taking off from Jalalabad airport, because Jalalabad is now one of the main centers of the Predator drone campaign. And as these, in a film, when you see the Bourne films, there's always, one drone, and there's a bunch of very clever guys in Virginia somewhere at sort of CIA headquarters controlling these things. It's not like that. In Jalalabad, it's like Heathrow taxi rank. These things are going off every 5 seconds. And we had this final conversation. The elders I came forward, Jagdalik introduced them. And I said, are there any, do you see the parallels? Or rather, what actually happened was that Jagdalik said, this man here, we captured his great uncle. And they had a good laugh about that. And then they said, and I said, do you see any parallels between them, your ancestors, my ancestors? And they said, it's exactly the same. Both times the foreigners have come here for their own interest, not for ours. They say, we are your friends, we want to help, but they are lying. Whoever comes to Afghanistan, even now, they will face the fate of Burns and McNaughton. They knew all these names. All these names, long forgotten in this country, were names very familiar to the Afghans. We are the roof of the world, said one of the elders. From here, you can control and watch everywhere. Afghanistan is like a crossroads for every nation that comes to power. But we do not have the strength to control our own destiny. Our fate is determined by our neighbors. Then one of the old men told me a story. He said, last month, some American officers called us to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them asked me, why do you hate us? And I replied, this is the elder speaking, because you blow down our doors, enter our houses, pull our women by the hair, and kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back, and we will break your teeth. And when your teeth are broken, you will leave, just as the Russians and the British left before you. It's just a matter of time. What did you say to that, I asked. He turned to his friend and said, if the old men are like this, what will the younger ones be like? In truth, all the Americans know that their game is over here. It's just their politicians who deny it. This, said the elder, is the last days of the Americans. Next, it will be China.